Hey, historians. Welcome to another week. We started off last week by getting into some of this modified DBQ practice. So we did contextualization. We'll start today by reviewing that and then going to thesis. Now, we haven't really talked about what makes this a modified DBQ yet. Don't worry, we will. Right now, we're just kind of hitting all the components that are the exact same between a modified and a normal. For those of you taking the AP test this year, this is how that format will be. It'll just simply be a modified DBQ. And for those of you who aren't taking the AP test, your final assessment in our class as well will be in this same format. So this is for everybody. With that being said, let's dive in. DBQ review part 2, thesis. Let's go back to what we mentioned in our first part, right? Your DBQ and your LEQ always begin with your context, so you can establish what is the topic, the players, the situation at hand. So we always use the Star Wars scroll. Does a great job of being succinct, right? It's about 3 sentences. Does a great job using proper nouns, Rebel Alliance, Death Star, things like that. And it says it in a clear way to establish what we are going to be discussing. So in short, your context should always be roughly 3 sentences or so. Shouldn't be too long. Remember, context and thesis will make up that first intro paragraph. So if your context is super long, it's going to kind of mess up that formula. It should not really be more than 20 or so years before the prompt. If you're getting too much further than that, then you are getting kind of away from the actual question at hand. So don't go too far back for that. Also, make sure you're staying on topic. Just because it's something that's happening in the era doesn't necessarily mean it's something that you need to bring up if it doesn't relate to your topic. So let's look at some that I thought were pretty good from our discussion board. Now, I did modify these responses a little bit. So if you did write this, I believe this one is by Zach, who was our first Carol Captain of the Week. Way to go, Zach. Bravo. Round of applause. Woo! I did modify a few things just to make an example, but let's again see our prompt, which is posted in the folder as well. Contrast the goals, strategies, and support for 2 phases of the American Civil Rights Movement, the nonviolent integrationist phase and the Black Power phase. Okay, so we know that the question type is a compare and contrast. Is something more similar? Is it more different? We can see the topics here is going to be civil rights in America. In the years, the first year we see pop up is 1955. So our context should be exploring really this kind of early period before 1955. So roughly 20 years before that and so forth. So let's take a look at what Zach wrote. He wrote, African Americans had been living through poor conditions prior to 1955. In 1925, African Americans were fed up with the poor treatment from white Americans that they began creating a society in Harlem that promoted African American art and music. Later, this would be known as the Harlem Renaissance. In 1929, the Scottsboro case was the false accusation that 9 African American teens raped 2 white girls on a train, showcasing the legal inequalities between races. Now, I know what you might be saying. Mr. Carroll, 1925, 1955, that's 30 years. Why'd you pick this one? Well, let me explain. Well, first, I love how in the first sentence, it drops 2 big pieces of info. Our group, right? African Americans, and also the time frame we'll be talking about right here in the red. In terms of the 1925 date, we're talking here about Harlem Renaissance. You could have also used Great Migration. One way, if you wanted to be a little more coy, you could have been like in the 1920s and 30s or language like that, but this would still work. It's still in that sweet spot. Notice too that the proper noun and term is used, Harlem Renaissance. And then to try to get into why change might need to happen, why a civil rights movement might need to occur, that's why I like this last sentence. The Scottsboro case, great example of legal inequalities being represented. Let's take a look at another context that works as well. It's a very different approach to it, but still works. African Americans faced a line of oppression long before 1955, such as Jim Crow segregation laws in the South. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first African American to play in Major League Baseball. Despite facing hostility from fans and other players, Robinson earned Rookie of the Year and helped lead the Dodgers to the World Series. With the rise of Robinson in the media, he began to speak out about the lack of African American rights and in 1949 testified in front of the House Un American Activities Committee. So, our next group of Carol captains for the week, this is kind of a blending of both Ashley's and Yasmin's context. So, shout out to them. Round of applause. Woo! A few things I liked about this. You can see it has a very different approach, but some similarities. The first sentence establishes who we're talking about and our years. Great, great, great. It also has contextualization. What's been going on in America? Oh, segregation laws, but not just that. Their name, Jim Crow. And this was kind of unique. They focused on an individual, Jackie Robinson, which kind of surprised me at first, but then I started thinking about it and I could kind of see the logic. A lot of these documents we're about to jump into are very focused on individuals. So by establishing the context of a prior individual, we're able to kind of do that bridge there. So that was actually pretty clever. And here at the bottom, we even see methods in which Jackie Robinson will try and create change, right? Speaking out, right? That's his avenue. And where? To Congress. So now we're actually getting kind of contextualization of how African Americans maybe promoted their own rights prior to 1955. So that would work as well. Let's take a look at what this question is really asking us to do, because we can't really start developing a thesis until we start to really understand the prompt. So that first word is the dead giveaway on the type of question, contrast. So we're doing a compare and contrast, or like a big Venn diagram, right? So on the left here, I have the integrationist phase, 1955, 1968. On the right here, I got the Black Power phase, 1964 and 1975. So your job is going to have to decide, are these two groups more different? Is this area and that area way more separated than this area here, what they share in common? Or are you going to argue that this middle area, this common ground, outweighs the differences they have on the wings? Of course, because we're historians, we're complex, we'll be mentioning all facets of this, but your job is to determine, do these opposite sides, do you think those matter more than what's in the middle? Our thesis formula is always the same between DBQ and thesis. I'm sorry, and LEQ. It's this three-sentence structure. We present complexity by arguing kind of the opposite of what our end answer will be, our X. And then we'll go, however, A and B, two pieces of evidence that's going to lead us to our Y, our answer to the prompt. Remember that your prompt, that Y, should be a very crystal clear statement on its own. It shouldn't just be, therefore, the two groups had more similarities. That's too weak, too vague. Make sure it's having made those years in there, it's having those proper nouns in there, it's being concise. A good way to think of this is the X will be a document, A and B will be each document. You're not completely fleshing those documents out, of course, here. We will do that later, but that's a good way to kind of check yourself from being too simple. Not just saying both groups wanted new laws. That's not going to work, right? Maybe talk about maybe John F. Kennedy promoted a Civil Rights Act. Now we're on to something. So I'm going to take a moment here to walk through the 5 documents with you to give you some kind of insight into them to help you create this thesis, because that's what I'm going to ask for you, is to, on our discussion board, share your thesis, so your 3-sentence formula. Document 1 here. Ooh, what do we got? First thing I always do is I look at the source, and I see the aptly named SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Statement of Purpose. Remember, our prompt here is trying to compare the goals, strategies, and support. So what did each side want? That's their goals. How did they go about achieving those goals? That's their strategies or their methods. And then their support. How much did they have people agree with them? So in this document, I see a purpose. So this is definitely going to help us answer the goals. In 1960, student nonviolent, this means it's absolutely going to go into our integrationist phase. So document 1 is going to tell us a lot about the goals and strategies for the integrationist phase. Document 2 is a primary source, right? This is a photograph, Alabama 1963. So one thing you'll want to take a note of is methods here, okay? So think of this in terms of methods. And it's going to fall into, from our years, our integrationist phase, try and use this to understand methods to achieve goals. I would also try and do a little research on what's going on in Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. I'm sure doing a little research there will give you some more context as to what's going on when this photo is taken. Our third document might stand out a little different because it's by President John F. Kennedy. So this is a prompt about competing civil rights movements, right? So what is the Caucasian president doing here? Well, I think it's going to have a lot to say. Think of this in terms of support, okay? Because that was another word in the prompt, support. Always put this into context. June 11th, 1963. My clue to you is that document 2 has a big influence on document 3. Try and figure out John F. Kennedy's level of support. Now, document 4 is very different. Stokely Carmichael. I actually he just came up in a Vietnam documentary I'm rewatching. I saw him earlier today. I put those together. I thought that was really fun. So this is kind of a call to action as well. This is from a speech, What We Want. So even though it doesn't say like purpose, right? You can absolutely view this as a goal, as a kind of a call to action for our other side of this Black Power. Our last document is a statement by the Minister of Defense of the Black Panthers, 1967. Again, we see the year, so that will tip us off as to which phase of the civil rights movement this is in. And this is going to absolutely have tons of elements of methods in it as well. So you can definitely find a lot of methodology in this fifth document. So your job then is to kind of start to weigh things as you kind of place these documents in your web here. Where do you think things are more clear? Do you think these two sides have more differences? If so, your why is going to talk about how vastly different they were. If you think there's a lot in common between their goals, supports, strategies, then your why is going to be more about, hey, these groups actually had a lot. As always, there's not a right way to answer these. There's just the way you utilize the evidence. And that is what makes you an historian. So we'll be talking about all the other elements later, but for this week, let's just try to get a thesis we're happy with. And we'll post it on the discussion board. Make sure you're checking out other people's posts to get maybe some help or inspiration. Make sure you're reaching out to me if you need some clarification. But I think you got this. I'll talk to you soon.